Yeah, good afternoon, everyone, again, and welcome to this third seminar in our series, What Were We Thinking? The idea of the seminar is really just to try to reflect on ways of thinking that have brought us to this planetary crisis we face right now, if we indeed believe that there is a crisis. Well, it seems pretty hard not to, but I mean, it is something we need to think about. But what we're assuming in the seminar anyway is that human activity is an outcome of human thought. So we're asking, well, what kind of thinking has brought us here to the brink of crisis? And possibly even, has thinking been going on at all yet? So we're inviting basically anyone from anywhere to help us consider how to think differently, or how to begin thinking in face of this threat to the world posed by us, by humankind. So today I'm very happy to introduce Prof. Vulindlela Nyoni to you. He is the head of Mandela University's Department of Visual Arts. He's primarily a printmaker with a kind of mix of interests and obsessions. He's a Marvel Comics and Star Trek fanatic. And his doctoral thesis developed an ontology of diasporic subjectivity, using the figures of belonging and home and nostalgia, and showing how they operate in the work of three artists who are living between South Africa and Zimbabwe. So for him, the question, what were we thinking, evoked these feelings of introspective kind of melancholy, and it suggests an acknowledgement of regret. So in the presentation, he's going to focus on this concept of regret. And he's arguing that many of the narratives created by contemporary art practices and films kind of shape our reality. And they're characterized by a strong dominant discourse of no regrets thinking. And this tends to prevent us from engaging authentically with regret. So on the one hand, he's arguing that in a time of this complex socio-political and environmental crisis, the sense of authentic regret is needed for genuine thinking about crucial and vexing issues, but it's continually kind of hampered by this nonchalant kind of no regrets thinking, which is prevalent in visual arts. And he also says that he wants to consider whether there's nonetheless something we can learn from no regrets thinking. So thanks so much for joining us, Vulindlela. I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Andrea. Your intro was quite a lot, and I hope I can live up to it. And as a caveat, perhaps to everyone, this is still a work in progress, coming from research that I've currently done, and I think reflecting on the thematic of what we'll be thinking, I've had to slowly come back into the complexities or the nuances of diasporic subjectivities, and then approach perhaps the delivering of this seminar in a sense of a human-centeredness or human understanding of regret, but then at the same time tie it into the sort of socio-political and environmental crises that we're going through. So I'm going to just share my screen quickly and begin. Let's see here. Andrea, if you could just let me see if you can see the screen.
Yes, it's perfect. Thanks.
Perfect. Excellent. Okay, so that's the title page. So I do believe as a visual artist that one really, we're all about telling stories. And I think that is something that I happen to love. It's something that I think everyone really should take note of, that, or at least understand that stories make up the world that we live in. And I'll say that again, but I think maybe just a bit of background as to why stories are important. I was fortunate enough, from a personal perspective, to grow up in a space in which these sorts of images and books and stories kind of informed me. So where did it all start? I've always had stories in my life. I've been fascinated by what stories, how they work, from ancient mythology to sort of local folklore. So both my parents were teachers, and we were fortunate enough to have a library at home. So it's sort of up to this date, I learned how to draw from comics, that sort of thing, and I think I still rely on that sort of mythological story creation as part of my impetus for being an artist, really. But there is definitely something quite common in the narrative or the range of narratives that you see up in front of you here. Uh, Stories have been central to my life. Narratives have always been central. I'm a cinephile as well. I watch a lot of movies. And even during my PhD, I did put some time aside every day to make sure that I took something in. Andrea, you're hearing that for the first time, but now the work is done. I can finally confess. Um, but there were stories I was exposed to as a child, as you can see here, and then there are stories that can have continued to kind of mystify me. And as mentioned, my parents also, or at least, the background that I came from, we were exposed to um, this particular sort of set of books, which was the African Writers series, which I think some of you may be familiar with. I'm thinking, Sharon, you might be familiar with the African Writers series by Heinemann. And for me, these two things propose, or at least present, a slightly different take on narrative. The one being, I suppose, the sort of more popular westernized sort of sense of storytelling, perhaps um, the I suppose westernized stories versus the sort of collection of and promotion of African storytellers such as Bessie Head there, as you can see. So I started to see why, or at least I started to think to why narrative is important. I would come home and sit in front of Encyclopedia Britannicas and try to get information, and it was a source of my curiosity, and why things were. I'd make up stories for myself, and I think, like I said to you, this has become part of the sort of natural way of doing things. I also had these types of stories. And that for me kind of like confounded me as to how, in all of these narratives of heroics, mythologies, folklore, um, and collections of real world situations and collections of African writers series and all the rest of it, there were these other narratives that presented a kind of conflicting reading, I suppose, of what my reality was made up of. These stories today, or these narratives today, would cause some people to go, "Oh my gosh, you can't sort of have that sort of around. You need to put that away. It's out of date, and needs to be censored in some ways." And in some ways, it fills us with a sense of regret that these sort of stories had to be told, or at least were created. They're stereotypical, they're racist, they exist. And that for me is of an interest. It promotes, or at least it inspires in me this kind of sense of some narratives were good and some narratives were bad. And at least, some narratives are heard of and some narratives are not heard of. So just to kind of give you that overview once more, just quickly. So I had these sort of popular media, the official sort of other reality given to me in a sort of academic sense, then my own curiosity through an encyclopedic knowledge of things, and then this kind of confounding constructed reality, which would then become interlinked and complex in a very complex way, a nuanced way, enmesh itself in my understanding of my own racial identity, my own identity as an African, and so forth. So just quickly, I'd like to show you this clip as to why the talk is called No Regrets. And I'll just play that here for a sec.
What's up, dog? Not much, dog. What's up with you? I'm here to pick up Casey, you know what I'm saying? What's your name, man? Sky P, you know what I'm saying? Well, I'm awake and I speak English, so yeah, I do know what you're saying.
Bye, we're gonna go.
Whoa.
Where do you think you're going? Would you please have a seat?
Hey, those are cool tats, man. Oh, for real. Thank you, bro. You see the Cobra? And what is this one? Oh, this? That's my credo. No regrets. You have no regrets?
Yeah.
No? Like not even a single letter? No way. Not me. Well, I love him. I think he's great.
Okay.
I think he's a real winner, Casey. If I were you, I wouldn't use protection. We're the Millers. We did our. Oh, she's gonna be fine. Tattooed kid on a motorcycle, no helmet. What could possibly go wrong? Now playing.
So I'm hoping some of you may have seen that film, but it sort of led me to kind of try and understand how narrative in itself plays out in constructing the sense of regret, or at least how we understand feeling how certain stories should be told or shouldn't be told. The clip sort of illustrates what one might view as like sort of carefree and careless behavior, and in that same time, the sort of conflict between the well-meaning judgment and conformity of the parental system. The prospective boyfriend, Scotty P, who you see there, keeps saying, "You know what I'm saying?" And the dad responds, "Well, yes, I'm speaking English, so yes, I do know what you're saying." Despite this, Scotty P then proceeds to show his tattoo, which reads "No Regrets." It's become a meme, and people do use it. Even today, I used it in a lecture with my second years, who I'm hoping are in this group. So I chose this clip, firstly, to kind of question the absence of regret, even though things are wrong, and perhaps the choice to be blissfully aware or unaware or ignorant. And secondly, the potential impact for the seemingly simple life choice of having a tattoo, for instance, or riding your motorcycle without a helmet, having permanent results for which no regrets may present as an unnameable freedom or agency, never mind the nuances in a narrative. As captured in the father's, well, what could go wrong? So as I've been saying, I believe that narratives determine kind of our understanding of the world. But you need to have an awareness or experience of a particular narrative to authentically regret the particularities of what that narrative does. We need to somehow regret authentically in some ways once we've recognized that something is wrong. But does it always have to be in a space of sadness? And that's where I start to, ask of people like current writers like Brene Brown and Kahneman, who sort of follow from people like Seneca, or philosophers like Seneca and Epictetus, who were Stoics, and talk about the nowness of living and face your challenges and move forward and all the rest of it. So what I have up here on the screen is a kind of really rather basic sort of, I don't mean it to be a polemic, I suppose, a kind of a way of thinking about the two different sets of thinking when it comes to regret. So no regrets thinking, kind of, one might think of it as move on, it's happened, we have to move on, it's happened in the past, we're here now, carry on. And we have to be in the moment. We have to kind of think about growing our mindset rather than having a fixed mindset. We have to think about taking risks and embracing challenges. And we have to think about the nowness of life. We have to understand that future is uncertain, so we deal with it. And we have to also learn from our failures. Regret thinking, on the other hand, is in some ways, it elicits a sense of mourning or remembering, or there's a show on SABC, I don't know if it's still going on, it's called Kumbuleka, which basically means remember home. And we have to live in that space of acknowledgement and ownership and dwelling on the past and understanding and taking accountability. And in most cases, it leads us to sort of risk-averse behavior of, let's say, keeping culture stagnant, or at least keeping traditions the way things were. To some extent, we sit there thinking this could have been so much better. So just a couple of, I'll flick through this slide quite quickly. It's just, just to kind of understand what story means, what narrative really means. There's so many different synonyms for this idea of narrative, and the ways in which we give narrative a title or describe it, from drama to fable to fantasy to so forth and so forth. But I want to just draw attention to Chimamanda Adichie's TED Talk, which some of you may have seen at some point, where she speaks of the danger of a single story. And that brings me back to the nuances of a narrative. In that, in many situations where we feel regret, we might be approaching or might be limited to a particular viewpoint or perspective, which is a singular narrative. The single story revolves around creating a perspective which goes unquestioned or imposes itself on the reading of the situation or a group of people. We tend to use a single story to generalize and stereotype. We use it to desensitize ourselves from the reality of the situation. So I find that in today's culture of no regret, I suppose there is this quick, fast, mainstream experience it, flash in the pan sort of reality that is given to us through mainstream media and so forth. And I find it in image and text and practice and tradition to be the most interesting thing. So again, we rely on narratives to shape the world we live in, be they oral tradition, YouTube reels, novels, and fiction, and so forth, and all the rest. True crime podcasts, educational curricula, or even just reading the back of a nutritional tub of yogurt or something like that. You're telling yourself a story about how your world is and how you might not have regret for eating a low-fat versus full-fat yogurt. And this is, for me, the important thing, because how we tell our stories is important. What stories we tell can connect us, not just as artists, but as humans. And I think too, how much we've been fascinated with history and how much of history we can either erase or reveal just by asking the right questions. And I think things like institutional policy, for instance, are actually part of narrative. They are, I sit in an institution myself, and I do believe that institutional policy, governmental policies, those are all parts of the narratives that we live with. Just a quick example of erasure from history in terms of visual arts. This is an artwork which is recently acquired by the Met in 2023, where a figure, as you can see on the right-hand side, wasn't present and was recently uncovered in a painting attributed to Jacques Amand. And then this really interesting example of mainstreaming the idea of storytelling through the empire's forgotten propaganda machine of a mobile cinema. And when I look at the kind of the programming of how a narrative is constructed around delivering interesting information to the natives, you have a program which says music, introductory talk, film, and all the rest of it. And I think to myself, my God, that sounds like any one of our normal meetings that we have on a weekly basis at any of our institutions. So this sort of structured way of telling or creating a reality around us, you end with God Save the Queen, you end with this particular way of proceeding with tradition or a way of seeing things. And just in this particular example, I just wanted to sort of highlight, or at least draw attention to an image such as the viewers of the mobile cinema to some of the narratives that were created around the sort of imagined Africa, the narrative that was constructed. So for many, this was mainstream. This was the stuff of reality in many for many years. The sort of dark continent history, or at least projected narrative of the continent. But when it comes down to issues of things like, can we regret this now? Just this morning, I gave a lecture to my second years around race and representation, and I showed an image of Linnaeus's taxonomy of different human classes of human. And the student, a young white student, stood there, sat there and said, after seeing this, she felt a lot of guilt and shame. And I said, well, how can you feel regret or at least remorse for something that you might not have been party to? You can see Linnaeus, and he's describing people as Americanus, red-skinned, and subduable, and so forth and so forth. So how do you process that? So, and I just wanted to kind of draw attention to the different ways of reading this sense of how we identify these particular emotions or sentiments. And for me, I suppose regret is something that, as I mentioned before, we recognize that something could have been done better. I think it was Gary's presentation a few weeks back about the environmental crisis, and Don't Look Up as a movie that sort of spoke of the crisis of the environment and how bad things are and things getting worse and so forth and so forth. A little bit of that is coming our way. Then we have things like guilt, where you acknowledge, I did a bad thing. Then you have shame, which is that internalization, or at least taking on the responsibility, the accountability of, I am a bad person. And then remorse, which is, I am sorry that I did a bad thing. And then there's a kind of undoing, which is exemplified here by Lady Macbeth's Amsterdam spot, leading to her own sort of downfall and suicide. Spoiler alert, sorry. But I am the cause of someone's failure. And the undoing, I'd like to leave kind of like hanging there, because it's a question we might think about. But regret, in some ways, for me, sort of revolves around this sort of cognitive space of acknowledgement of something bad. You can say, I never felt the slightest pang of regret for what I did. All right. And that means you've chosen to recognize that something happened, and it's a cognitive process. It's not simply a descriptive statement of what people feel and do. According to Bedford, the statement reflects the justification of a choice. My choice was quite correct, and it is sound and justified. In other words, regret in this view is primarily a matter of critical judgment, and not only secondarily or not at all a matter of feelings. It is cool, calm, and collected. So, but it can also be emotional, which leads to, or at least some people might experience regret as an emotional thing, which leads to guilt, shame, remorse, and eventually, I suppose, an undoing. Now to the part which I like to talk about, which is films. We have a director here, Antoine Fuqua, a very well-known director, and you can see a list of his filmography on the side here, and he is going to be soon directing the 2025 biopic of Michael Jackson. But he also did what I consider to be one of the worst films I've ever watched, in 2003, called The Tears of the Sun. And there are big money spinners. This is, it's not to say that this is a judge of his character or quality of his movies, but rather that there are mechanisms in place that maintain the circuit of the culture of his making. And I wonder what his movie about Michael is going to be about. When he directed a movie of this ilk called Tears of the Sun, and I'm not going to show any clips or anything like that, but if just from the images, I think you can tell the sort of sentiments that were being purported in that movie. So big spenders, mainstream movies, mainstream narratives, the larger than life sort of realities of our consumption or popular media allow us perhaps, or don't allow us to perhaps engage with regret in an authentic space. And I just wanted to read this out here in terms of what I mean by the impact of big, spectacular things. 100 million movie productions in the time of bigness, sorry. I want to speak for the small invisible acts of the human spirit, so subtle and so small that they die when brought out under the Klieg lights. I want to celebrate the small forms of cinema. And it is within the space of independent cinema that we find interesting stories being told. We all would obviously go to our big box office heavy hitters and sit and watch the movies. But at what point do we critically engage with the narratives and ask of ourselves, for instance, is this narrative doing anything for me, and what of it should I be regretful for? Some of you might want to rewatch the whole Lord of the Rings trilogy, for instance, and see if you can spot how many times two women talk to each other, and just to give you a sense of the reality of that. Two women only speak to each other in the Lord of the Rings once in the Battle of Helm's Deep, and it's for 2 seconds, but anyhow. So in times of bigness, looking at the small films, looking at films that perhaps give you a different perspective of a narrative. So think back to the original images that I showed you of, let's say, constructed Africa. Those were quite big box office recipients out of Africa and so forth. And then we had the eventuality of the Rwanda genocide, which decimated the population. And a lot of films and a lot of stories were told, but not many of them had the same clout, except for the one, Hotel Rwanda in the right-hand corner. Had the clout by which one would turn around and go, oh my goodness, this is a story that one needs to be told of. And does that come from a space of the conflict being on a continent where this sort of narrative is expected? Or is it something that is so removed from other people who would be benefiting in terms of cost benefit? Is it so removed from their experience that it's not necessarily something to be spoken of? All of these movies are extraordinary. I just want to mention that Paul Rusesabagina is under some review in Rwanda. He was the hotel manager for Hotel Rwanda, and there's a continuing narrative around the controversy and his allegiances. But in the meantime, the other stories are also something you might need to sort of watch. And when you watch a movie like that, do you start asking yourself, at what point do I start regretting? At what point do I feel responsible or accountable for what's going on there? And what part of it is all about the incomplete narratives that are missing from the storytelling in mainstream media and mainstream visual art? Interestingly enough, this is the current status of Hotel Rwanda, and I talked about the cost benefit of regret. One should have to think about at what point do you feel authentic regret, or at what point is your cost of regret going to benefit you, or if it costs too much, should you regret it at all? And reducing it down to monetary terms, and perhaps talking about how interwoven or perhaps nuanced these things are, you know, this doesn't reflect in some ways, in many ways, the reality of some of those atrocities that were committed back then. So we jump now to Christopher Nolan, for instance, whose net worth at the moment is 750 million US dollars. And he's just recently directed Oppenheimer. And his box office hits and box office bombs, never mind the narrative, are based on him as a person, really. So typically regret is defined in these models as the coolest in cognitive terms. In other words, it's the difference between the payoff or the outcome actually received, and the maximum possible payoff or the best possible outcome for someone like Nolan in terms of making these movies that he makes. Now, I did sit through Oppenheimer and I did watch it. It's not a question of like, I didn't enjoy the movie, I did. But does the movie in itself serve the role of a pariah, embodying a sort of future nostalgia or a regret that we should have? I mean, the film is filled with a lot of very important people, heavy hitters, from Matt Damon to obviously Cillian Murphy and so forth, and it won so many awards and amazing score. And I sat there with surround sound and lots of, you know, bang, thrumming noises and all the rest of it. It was a spectacle. Oppenheimer is referred to as an American Prometheus, and the third act of the movie has a profound and vivid, albeit Nolan-esque, and I use it quite specifically, his particular stylistic interpretation of the internal conflict Oppenheimer seemingly had. Without dropping any spoilers, there were montages of lots of flashing lights and cutscenes and close-ups of Cillian Murphy's piercing blue eyes and his white skin blown out and overexposure from camera flashes or perhaps explosions of bombs, along with a tremendous score and sound engineering and thrummings and bangings. They all sort of have us observe or acknowledge tragedy by proxy. And is this vulnerability and this regret that he seems to have viewable as an honorable trait only when the privileged has the platform on which to speak about it? Just in relation to that, when the spectacle becomes truth, we have an issue about matters of what happens when the way a story is told becomes the truth, and how it is described and how it takes hold in a phenomenological sense and has a profound ontological impact. So on the left-hand side here, we have Los Angeles in the cinematic version, the city of perpetual cinematic destruction, and on the right-hand side, a real situation of the Jabalia refugee camp. So when the way a story is told and how it's described takes hold, it really should shift our perspectives. But if I were to draw comparisons, in 1991, we witnessed the death of Rodney King at the hands of police. And 20 years later, we also witnessed the death of George Floyd in not exactly the same way, but from the death of police. So the narrative didn't shift, and the regret still kind of has this sort of space of disconnect within our currency. I'm going to show you a clip here of a trailer, which I think is very important. And I spoke of independent movies, and I think this is one of those films which I think everyone should really see. It's called The Act of Killing, by my favorite nihilist, Werner Herzog, and directed by Joshua Oppenheimer. To that particular clip was that there's the project or the film itself, The Act of Killing, is about the genocide that was, gosh, now it's lost my mind. Where did it happen? It was 1960. I forget now. I had written it down. And the project by Oppenheimer and Joshua Oppenheimer, the director, was to go and have the perpetrator of these crimes recreate and direct his own retelling of the atrocities that he committed. And as the story unfolds, things get worse as he starts to see and reveal, the atrocities to himself. He starts to go beyond regret and start to experience remorse in many ways. So up until that point, he'd perhaps been living with a no-regret philosophy, but I would recommend that film to anyone. I think I don't want to talk too much about it just yet because there's still a bit of time to go, and I got a little bit to cover, but we can come back to that. The next examples I'd like to show you are particularly to do with the idea of art or an artwork made with the mind to deliver a narrative, but yet the manner in which the narrative was delivered, or at least how it is then controlled or at least managed by an institution, prohibits the authentic experience of what the work is about. So the work in question is by Ai Weiwei, and it's a sunflower seed, which some of you may have been fortunate enough to see. And it was installed at the Tate turbine and sponsored by Unilever at the time. Of course, some issues with Unilever at the moment, but he had millions of sunflower seeds or ceramic pieces, little ceramic seeds made up and painted. And then he distributed them all over the ground of the Tate Modern Turbine Hall, and people were able to interact with them. Now, the issue is when it first opened, people could walk across it or roll in it or count the seeds, but it's now fenced off by a minuscule little fence. So it sits undisturbed, more like a museum exhibit, a strange forbidden sea of sunflower seeds, and it doesn't quite work because they're so small and together and huge, but you can't get in amongst them anymore. He's helped us to see, sort of imagine and consider and ponder what we get from trade. And I think that's mostly what he was speaking of there. And my image of Mao Zedong, I think is a direct relationship as to why Ai Weiwei would have used sunflower seeds, because Mao Zedong had a particular relationship with them as well. So people would have been interacting with them, crushing them, walking all over them, until the British art authorities literally said, no, you're crushing them, you're destroying the artwork, and you are creating dust. And it's to save the artwork, you're going to fence it off. So that stopped people having an authentic interaction with the works themselves. And I find that to be regrettable. I find that to be regrettable because at the end of it all, it doesn't necessarily come to bear that you can understand the labor and the concrete realities of the narrative if you have to stand behind a fence and observe from that distance. Now, when it comes to the environment, I just want to jump to some documentaries that have been made in the past, and the idea of where we are in our relationship to the crisis that is environmental, and where our relationship to regretting what we have done or not regretting what we have done, or at least thinking to ourselves, it doesn't really concern me, this world is not for me, I'm not going to have children, or I'm not going to be here in 200,000 years when these people talk about the earth exploding. you know, to what extent do these moments of regret, or is there something about these documentaries that keep us living or in a cycle of guilt, I suppose, over, rather than, you know, saying this is happening, we need to change the narrative. And perhaps in these two cartoons, you know, green capitalism will save the planet. We care so much about the earth that we even recycle our own propaganda. These two illustrations kind of speak to the same sort of sentiment. Again, no regrets is a place of freedom and agency, but we could become more complicit in not changing the narrative, or we could drown in our own guilt and stay there. So, is it sufficient to say that regret is temporal and the narratives live on? Or is it possible to have gone too far to authentically feel regret for something? I'm not so sure. I've been exploring this in terms of trying to see how it might be possible to understand our takeaways from narratives, from visual art, from experiencing things that, if we feel guilty about something, why is it that we do? Sometimes the extraordinary is easier to regret than the ordinary, and perhaps that's why we flee to escapism and, you know, the imagined disasters of alien worlds and all the rest of that. And dare I say, I mean, I'm not going to offend anyone here. I don't necessarily need to. I don't want to, but you know, we have our own crises here at home, which are they overwritten in some ways overridden in some ways by the horrors of what is happening up north? Why is it we can be regretful and show regret for the terrors and horrors that are happening in the rest of the world, when someone in Walmer is cutting their grass quite nicely and cleanly, with fresh running water, and someone else in Walmer Township is having to walk over sewage and step over a, you know, I don't know, garbage, and a cow's eating plastic out of a bin bag. So I think those are kind of the questions that I ask as to how we generate narratives that either encourage us to have regret thinking or no regret thinking. So where do we go from here? Should we live in a permanent state of regret and existential crises? Knowing that regret thinking can stultify and stagnate. It can imprison one in a temporal sense, but it can also keep one alert, aware, and engaged if you know what is wrong. And no regrets thinking, on the other hand, can lead us to a state of uncritical, blissful ignorance, whereby we might end up being implicit in an oppressive narrative. But it can also energize and can make us challenge. You know what I'm saying? But my common sense is definitely tingling around this. I think I'll stop there, Andrea. I think we're going to be close for questions in time. But thank you.
Okay, thanks, Vulindlela. Yes, a huge amount of material to deal with and to think.
Sorry.
It's okay. So we are a little bit over, well, we're not over time in the actual seminar yet, but we have a shortish time for responses and questions and comments. So I'd like to open it up for that. I think you can just stick your hand or use that the hand function if you would like to chat, and then I'll just field comments. I'm hoping I'm going to be able to see hands in this. But if you are dying to chat and I'm ignoring you, then just stick on your camera and butt in. Okay. Oh, good. Yeah, I can see hands. Gary.
Hey, Gary.
Yeah. Hi. Open to you.
I just wanted to have the privilege of saying Dr. Nyoni first, you know, that was
You're sorry, I've already taken it.
Taken it.
Vulindlela, I wanted to, just in terms of you talking about the narrative and changing the narrative, have you got ideas on how you change the narrative?
So I think, you know, there's this whole thing about you can only regret what you're aware of. Okay. And I think one could say, if I'm not aware of it or I haven't been made aware of it, then what's the point of being regretful for it? And I think that is I don't have an answer to that question, or I don't have an answer to that particular statement I've just made, but I would say that a fully engaged and aware person, or at least a situation or structure, should be responsible for shifting the narrative. I think that there's a cost benefit to keeping things the same. And I find that the shifting the narrative sometimes is not enough. It costs too much for some. It costs far too much. I mean, with GM Motors and the electric car, for instance, it costs a lot more it cost a lot less to fight them in court around the electric car than to shift all the, you know, the idea of fossil fuels and all the rest of it. So shifting a narrative is not about whether you can see what's right or not. I think it's a question of whether it's worth your while, if I'm making sense.
Yeah, Andrew, if I may just follow up on that. The problem, I think, Vulindlela, is that your narrative is created in the moment from what you experience in the moment. The regret is a future, is you reflecting back on that moment, having now experienced the world differently or experienced it more. So you have a different perspective on which to, you know, so the question would be is, how do you in this moment look forward? You know, how do you extend outside of your what shaped your perspective originally, which you now regret? You know, so like the Rwanda story, how would that community that sort of took a binary narrative, which then drove the genocide? I mean, I'm simplifying it horribly, but
yes, of course.
How would they? Was it possible for them to have reflected into the future and regretted the future, kind of thing? I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, there is an aspect of, you know, possible self, you know, regret for possible self. So I mean, you could regret. Someone asked me something similar the other day. It's like, can you possibly regret not having something in the future, or something having not happened? I don't know if I can answer that question, Gary. I think, for instance, the way that the people, let's use Rwanda as an example. I think the revisitation of the horrors that they went through in a kind of annual, or at least committed revisitation, talking to each other, having this sort of reform, not enlivening the process or reliving it, but at least re-engaging, so that it's a never forget sort of process. That leads you to a forward-thinking process. So they don't live with something happened. They can acknowledge it, but they don't live with a guilt or shame. In fact, they live with more of a positivity around, we are able to move forward from that, I think, if I'm making sense.
Yeah, thanks.
Can I
Yeah.
snatch an opportunity to just throw something else into the mix? And it was something that you said in your presentation. It was a question you asked, and I'd like to bring it up more. It's that, is it possible to have gone too far, to authentically feel regret. And if we look at the narratives that we're telling ourselves, the mainstream narratives, what were you saying of economic prowess and of war and power and of spectacle and of human greatness and all of that, have we taken ourselves too far away from nature, too far away from indigenous kind of what would you call it, ways of thinking that are smaller, more independent, those kinds of things? Have we actually just gone too far away from that we cannot actually feel regret for the loss of nature, the regret for the loss of cultures? We've gone too far.
Yes and no. I think there's a yes and no answer to that, because if we say that we've gone too far, we are assuming in some ways that we as human beings have developed to a point of, this is where the transhumanists might step in and say, like, there's machines and things that can think for us to help us have a moral code of some sort. But at the end of it all, I don't know. I don't think we've moved out of the cave. I think our basic instincts are as simple as, we know what is wrong and what is right, and where we can balance ourselves within the environment that we can. Where we have gone too far is not being able to hold others accountable for what has happened. So this is again coming back to that regret question. Right in the middle of COVID, 3 of the richest men in the world blast themselves up into space, and again, this is not for me to tell people how to use any money or whatever it is, but what better example than, human hubris than 3 people sort of just throwing themselves into space during the worst crisis in humanity since the Spanish flu. And that for me is not a question of like, okay, they deserved it, they've progressed, they've moved on, but actually it's a choice for them to say, we don't necessarily regret. Have we gone too far? No, I think we just have gone away. We've lost the ability to be accountable, and accountable in terms of knowing that regret should lead us to something. Have I answered your question? I don't know.
Yeah, yes and no. But I'd like Helen to jump in here.
Hello, everybody.
Hi.
Nice to be here. I'm thinking about narrative, and I'm thinking about it in terms of sort of performance and play acting, where either there's no regrets or there's a regret, and and nothing happens. And it seems to me where you feel bad enough for remorse, for change, it takes some kind of love, maybe, and it takes some kind of willingness to be changed in a way that is going to take you out of any script that you know. Right. And I wonder, you touched on Lady Macbeth and undoing a suicide, but it brings to mind the possibility that remorse could lead to just letting us be changed by grief and remorse, and we're not going to do it. Yeah, doesn't that sound silly? But nevertheless, there it is.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the questions I do sort of ask myself: must we be in a space of sadness and mourning for us to be changed, to find? Must we embody shame? Must we embody remorse in order to heal? And I think, perhaps coming back to Andrea's question, have we gone too far? Perhaps it is a question of like, it's linked to this healing space, that sort of, to continue to consume sort of the mainstream popcorny sort of stuff doesn't allow us to engage in the real pain and the real authentic realities. We start living in this simulacrum, this space of constructed stories, and therefore you don't see the crisis, you don't experience the realities of it all. So I do think you're correct there. Yeah. Thank you.
So that would go back to the thing of, if we've lost touch with the things that we ought to feel regretful about, how are we ever going to feel regret? Which means, back to Gary's question, how are we ever going to change? I mean, how do you enable us to reconnect with, I would say, nature, for instance? How on earth can you regret the despoiling, the poisoning, the loss of nature that you've never had experience of? Why would you care? I mean, there's nothing there for you to actually get hold of. So I don't know if that means dragging everyone back into the bush. I mean, I'd love to do that, of course. But yeah, or if not dragging everyone back into the bush, then enabling everybody to have connections with the cultures that are being lost. Yeah, because you can't regret something that you don't know.
Yeah.
I don't think. I mean, this is, I mean, maybe Gary can come back in there.
No,
It's like he's holding his head in his hands.
No, I think look, you can express regret for something you don't know. I just think that if we were to understand it as not, again, that sense that regret is a cognitive process of understanding that something is bad or could be better, and the emotional side effects of those being sort of shame, guilt, remorse, and some part of regret as an emotion, which is like, I feel bad for this happening. But
And sorry, as Helen said, I think that's
yes,
yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
But I think that that this whole thing of like, at what point how far do you go, and how do you change the narrative, and what's the point of regretting something you've never had? I sometimes think to myself, we've been on Earth for I've been on Earth for a certain amount of time, but human beings have been on Earth for millennia. And at some point, there was this scribe living in Egypt named Imhotep, and he was scratching out in cuneiform on a cube or whatever it is, how much he hated his neighbor. And then it got into a big row and all the rest of it. And they lived thousands of years ago. I have no connection to what happened there, but maybe something happened and something happened back there. I can't regret that. It wasn't part of my reality. It was back then. But maybe the fault of us as human beings is that we live within, this is the no regrets thing, no regrets, is that we have a very short time span of life. And we can only live up to, let's say, 85 plus to 120 years now of experiencing life. So unless we find a way to transfer our genetic and physical memories into each other so we can carry the burdens of other people's experiences, regret is going to be something that's constantly recycled. So do you change the narrative? Don't know.
Yeah. Okay. We're just pretty much on the edge of time. I just want to give Janine a chance to just chat about empathy, and then I think we must close up after that.
Sure.
Oh, sorry. Janine here from Poch. My internet is a bit not dependable, so I'm not going to put on my camera. I've been thinking about the idea of empathy and how that factors, and I'm wondering how that factors into this conversation, because I think remorse and regret, it seems to me that empathy needs to be somewhere in this conversation. And I've been thinking specifically about the Afrikaans poet Antjie Krog's work in this regard, with empathy and trying to think yourself into the skin of someone else and begging to be another skin color, for example, and trying to be Yeah,
So,
and I yeah,
yeah,
so yeah,
begging to
that's
be
my
black in the
question.
country of myself. Yeah. Phew. You know, that's a difficult one, because you know the point of narrative in terms of telling a story for, you know, from another's perspective, has been a point of contention in art making and within the visual arts specifically, because you know the right to represent sort of holds it's holds a very sort of guarded space. The right to represent in terms of black bodies, for instance, who depicting a black body. For instance, Dana Schurz's painting of Emmett Till in his coffin caused a huge uproar at the Met in America. And Angie Krok, I think, also, you know, got some backlash around her sentiments. But empathy, I don't think can or can be equated to sort of um, being in situ or standing in for or representing. I think it means feeling with. In my mind, I think that would be a better description, feeling with rather than feeling for. Is that sort of clearish? I mean, I think empathy is necessary. Sorry?
You can't feel empathy for something that happened, you're saying, before your lifespan, or something that might happen after your lifespan. So you would need empathy to feel regret. I can't regret the loss of your culture because I have no empathy for it, because I'm not feeling with you. That's what you're saying. Whereas I think Ankie Krok might be wanting to say, I'm begging to be black. I want to empathize. I want to feel regret for the loss of your culture. Yeah, it's, oh, I don't know, lots of questions. Gary, last comment.
There's definitely, like I said, it's a work in progress. I mean, there's lots to be talked about.
Yes, and we'll come back to it. Yeah.
I just wanted to open the door to the warehouse. You'd made the statement, we haven't left the cave. And I'm very interested in that. But it's a warehouse, you know, it will take us another 5 hours, I think, of discussion. So I think it's something to come back to. The one question that is in the back of my mind is whether we actually have changed, whether we fundamentally changed. I mean, we've changed the look and touch and feel of us, but the way that we primarily act in the world, I'm not sure that we have changed that, you know. Yeah, but I mean, the implication of that is huge. I mean,
yes, of course.
Yeah. And I've been talking a lot with this thing about whether there's hope, you know, in the environmental movement, there's this big question about whether you center your debate around hope or not, you know, and that you must have some kind of hope of that the change is possible to be able to embark on change initiatives. And I'm not sure.
And you're losing hope, Gary.
No,
yes.
no, I think I've abandoned hope in exchange for agency. Is I think that you've got agency, you don't have hope. So you just got to do stuff in the hope that changes.
I think it's a question. It's a question that's sort of, like I keep saying, that it's not a question of what the narrative is; it's how it's being told. And yes, you know, like what institution sort of or what structures are in place to tell a narrative that allows you to feel regret in a certain way. If it doesn't allow you to feel regret in a certain way and keeps you in a certain position, then you can lose hope very easily. You can start becoming nihilistic about things because you don't see a way out. But for instance, if we were in a situation where on television, all I ever saw forever and had been since I was born were white people on television and was never exposed to anything that look like me, then I would only be exposed to that. But the narratives are changing, and narratives have changed. And we are kind of like seeing that there are alternatives to things. You just have to ask why we're not seeing more of it faster. Perhaps the anti-woke generation who start saying, as you start, race swapping certain characters, you're challenging their narrative. And you get these like people going like, oh no, Ariel's all black now. And you go, well, why can't she be? And that is where the narrative changes. That's where the hope resides, in that there is a bit of a pushback. Don't lose hope, Gary.
Let's stop there. So with a whole lot of dust raised in the air and actually quite a lot of confusion and questions, and that's great. That's where we should be. That's where we should stop, with a urge to carry on next week with the discussion.
Cool.
Okay. So Vulindlela, thank you very much for throwing dust in our eyes. Maybe the dust from all your sunflower seeds.
I'm sorry if it was a bit muddled at some points, but I mean there was
fine.
something.
It's actually a necessary kind of process of grappling with all of these issues. So thank you everybody for adding to the dust. And at some point we will start trying to unwrap and unravel and just see what we can actually make of all of this. But at this stage we're in that brainstorming stage of trying to grapple with all sorts of things that are on the table. So thank you very much. It was very interesting, very illuminating. And as you can see, we could go on for, as Gary said, for years. But we are going to stop now. And yes, thank you.
Thank you everyone for attending.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Willie.
Bye.
Dr. Nyoni, thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.